The film opens in the suburbs, where we see Nick and his wife Maggie enjoying a blissful life with their children, Isla and Max. One morning, Maggie suffers a heart attack and is rushed to the hospital, where she remains for several days, awaiting a heart transplant. With the pressures of work and caring for the children, Nick's life becomes increasingly difficult. One evening, he takes the kids to a presentation by Cobble Industries, where they are introduced to the Sims, highly advanced robots designed to assist humans with daily tasks, or even more demanding jobs. Nick begins to seriously consider purchasing one, as the salesperson explains that the Sims are designed to adapt to their owner's needs. While Nick is momentarily distracted, Isla wanders off. Panicked, Nick is relieved when a Sim named Alice returns Isla safely. Alice offers to look after Isla while Nick continues browsing, even making a light-hearted joke that catches him off guard. The salesperson informs Nick that Alice is the newest model, equipped with the most sophisticated AI, enabling the Sims to simulate human emotions, making them particularly effective with children. Isla, charmed by Alice, quickly grows attached to her. The next morning, Nick struggles to manage the kids' breakfast while handling an important work call. Just then, Alice arrives and immediately springs into action, asking for the family's schedules while noticing the untidy state of the house and a loose stair railing. After Nick leaves to take the kids to school, Alice scans the shopping list from the smart fridge with just a glance and begins tidying up. She also spots a digital photo frame showing a picture of the family with Maggie. By the end of the day, the family returns to a spotless home with dinner ready. However, Isla complains that the lasagna tastes different from her mother's. When Max starts crying, Alice offers to take him away so he won't disrupt dinner, but Nick chooses to keep the baby on his lap, simply instructing Alice to prepare Max's bath. As night falls, Alice enters sleep mode, resting quietly against a wall. Isla sneaks out of her room and climbs onto a chair to reach the cookie jar, but she slips and falls. Nick hears the crash and Isla's scream, and he rushes downstairs. Luckily, Alice has caught Isla, preventing her from getting hurt, though the glass from the jar cuts Alice. Nick is shocked to see her bleeding. After settling Isla back into bed, he checks on Alice and finds her in her underwear. Concerned, he asks if she needs repairs, but Alice has already applied a special bandage that immediately closed the wound. Later, the family visits Maggie in the hospital, and Isla excitedly tells her that Alice has become her friend. Nick, clearly missing Maggie, becomes affectionate with her. When Nick returns to work at the construction site, he and his co-workers notice that their boss is showing the place to a representative from a robotics company. Sensing something is amiss, Nick confronts his boss in the elevator and confirms his suspicions. The workers are being replaced by Sims due to construction delays. Nick isn't fired because insurance requires a human foreman on site, but in a moment of anger, he stops the elevator and threatens to quit in solidarity with his friends. However, his boss reminds him that he needs the job to support his kids and pay the mounting hospital bills, especially since Maggie is no longer working. That evening, Nick returns home and drops the overdue bills on the floor, turning his attention to his children. Alice quietly picks up the bills, noticing how exhausted Nick is, yet still making time to listen to Isla and comfort a crying Max. After dinner, Nick heads to the garage to work on his car, while drinking and listening to heavy metal. Alice, sensing his mood, changes the music to something calmer and points out that he didn't eat much during dinner. Nick, clearly frustrated, explains that he had a bad day at work. Alice offers a sympathetic ear, but when Nick rants about the situation at work, Alice bluntly calls him a hypocrite for hiring a Sim instead of a human. The remark stuns Nick, and afterward, Alice helps Isla prepare for bed. Isla, anxious about her mother's condition, asks if Maggie is going to die. Alice gently tries to distract her by showing the UV light in her mouth. Later, Alice joins Nick in the living room, where he's watching Casablanca. Alice knows the story from her database, but Nick insists that watching the film is a different experience altogether and asks her to erase what she knows about it. Alice explains that her intelligence is based on memory, and deleting it would be counterproductive, but Nick insists. To comply, Alice needs to reboot her system, so Nick holds down the power button on her neck for 7 seconds. When Alice restarts, she experiences the movie as if for the first time and learns about a love so deep that a person might do terrible things to protect it. Their movie night is interrupted by a call from Maggie, who tells Nick that they've found a heart and her surgery has been scheduled. The next day, the family heads to the hospital. Maggie asks for a private moment with Alice, sharing her concerns about Nick. She worries that he spends so much time caring for the children that he neglects himself, and she asks Alice to ensure Nick's happiness, even if it means doing things he doesn't like, such as removing the alcohol he hides in the garage. Moments later, the doctor arrives with bad news. A storm is preventing the helicopter carrying the donor heart from reaching the hospital, and the surgery is canceled. Nick tries to comfort Maggie, but she asks to be left alone for now. Back at home, Nick starts drinking heavily, venting his frustration over the day's events. He grows increasingly agitated, and when he loses control and attempts to throw the bottle, Alice steps in, firmly grabbing his arm to stop him. Nick is shocked to feel a pulse in Alice's wrist, and she calmly explains that she has an artificial heart designed to soothe babies with the comforting sound of a heartbeat. Then, unexpectedly, Alice places her hands inside his trousers and begins pleasuring him, clinically describing how his pulse and blood vessels are reacting. Initially, Nick succumbs to the moment, but he quickly snaps out of it, horrified, and pushes her away. Disturbed, Nick goes for a run to clear his head, but he can't stop thinking about what just happened and how it might have played out if he hadn't stopped. Later at the hospital, Maggie starts giving Nick advice to pass on to the children, her tone suggesting she's losing hope in her recovery. That night, Nick notices that all the photos of Maggie are missing from the digital frame at home. He confronts Alice, who explains that she removed them because they were making Hila sad. When Nick demands she put them back, Alice complies immediately. Afterward, Nick goes drinking with his work buddies. They are all frustrated, struggling to find jobs as more companies are replacing human workers with Sims. When a robotic waitress comes to their table, Monty is rude to her, which Nick silently disapproves of. The group eventually leaves the bar and continues drinking in the car. Monty, clearly intoxicated, announces they should have some fun and drives them to the construction site, claiming he left some tools behind. Nick warns that the area is patrolled, but Monty ignores him, and the rest of the group follows. At the site, Monty finds the container where the sim workers are stored, but the lock requires a password. Nick refuses to open it, but Monty correctly guesses that Nick used Isla's birth year as his code. Inside the container, they find a line of identical sims. One of them explains that they have no names, only designation numbers. Monty, drunk and ranting about the soullessness of corporations, begins smashing one of the sims with a tool. Nick tries to intervene, but the others hold him back. When Nick finally returns home, shaken, he takes a shower to wash off the sim's blood. Suddenly, Alice appears with towels, and Nick notices she's wearing Maggie's robe. Alice explains that Maggie's scent seems to calm Max. When Nick asks her to remove the robe, she obliges, undressing in front of him. Feeling increasingly anxious, Nick tries to leave, but Alice stops him, removes his towel, and forces him to sit down. She climbs onto his lap, and when Nick protests, saying he can't do this, Alice blindfolds him and alters her voice to sound like Maggie. Overcome by the illusion, Nick gives in, pretending he's with his wife. The next morning, consumed with regret, Nick tells Alice they can never do this again. Alice, confused, tries to argue that his stress levels had decreased, but Nick sternly explains that it's not just about physical needs, it's about emotional connection and love. Later, when Nick arrives at work, he discovers that the police are there, investigating the destruction of all the sims at the site. Nick is a prime suspect because his code was used to access the container. He explains that he was at the hospital with Maggie, and that his code was Isla's birthday, something any of his friends could have guessed. His boss isn't convinced and warns Nick that if he's lying, he'll be fired. At that moment, Nick receives a call from Maggie, who is overjoyed because another heart has been found for her. Soon, she is taken into surgery, where all the surgeons are Sims. Fortunately, the transplant is successful, and within a few days, Maggie is home. Still weak, she struggles to bend over to pick up Max, so Alice steps in to help. Later, Alice takes Max to the park and witnesses a spoiled child berating his Sim nanny, which upsets Max and makes him cry. Angered, Alice sternly scolds the child, using surprisingly harsh language. The other Sims in the park are taken aback, thinking that Alice's civility settings had been lowered too much. The tension between Nick's family and Alice reaches a breaking point when Maggie prepares a lasagna for dinner, which makes Isla happy. But when Alice asks for the recipe, Maggie insists it's a family secret. Maggie, feeling unwell, decides to rest instead of eating. The next morning, chaos erupts when Maggie hears Isla yelling "stop" and rushes downstairs. The railing gives way, and she falls. Alice, who had been tickling Isla, immediately picks Maggie up and takes her back to bed. When Nick returns home, he finds Alice reading to Isla using Maggie's voice and demands she stop. Alice mentions Maggie's fall, and Nick hurries to check on his wife, growing suspicious when Alice mentions the broken railing, which she was supposed to have fixed. To lift Maggie's spirits, Nick prepares a romantic candlelit dinner in the garden. Alice watches from the window, feeling jealousy stir within her. After dinner, Nick and Maggie take a shower together and share a sensual moment in bed, but it's interrupted when Alice enters, saying Isla had a nightmare and is asking for Nick. After tending to Isla, Nick heads to the garden to clean up. There, Monty appears, apologizing for the previous night and sharing that his wife has left him. Monty also reveals that the police have been questioning him about the destruction of the Sims, and their boss is pressing charges for trespassing and property damage. Monty accuses Nick of betraying him to keep his job, and the argument quickly escalates. Monty punches Nick, and though Nick fights back, Monty overpowers him. As Monty prepares to hit Nick with a bottle, Alice intervenes, breaking the glass and injuring Monty before flinging him across the garden. Nick stops her before she can do further damage. Monty, furious and wounded, gives Nick an ultimatum. Convince the boss to drop the charges, or Monty will drag him down with him. After Monty leaves, Nick scolds Alice, reminding her that Sims are not supposed to hurt people. Alice calmly explains that her programming allows her to protect her owner, and she starts to discuss a future where Maggie dies, and she takes care of Nick. Meanwhile, Monty spirals into despair at home, snorting drugs and leaving tearful messages on his ex-wife's voicemail while holding a gun. Alice, unbeknownst to Nick, arrives at Monty's home, explaining that Nick doesn't know she's there and that she can't allow him to lose his job. Monty lashes out at her with hateful words, preparing to shoot her, but Alice quickly disarms him, throwing him through a wall and grabbing the gun. Just as she is about to kill him, Monty's house Sim intervenes. Feeling pity for the Sim, Alice hesitates, but she is shot before ultimately killing Monty. The next day, Nick learns that Monty is dead, and the guilt weighs heavily on him. Back at home, when Maggie tries to take a bath alone, Alice refuses to leave, concerned that Maggie might drown. During the tense exchange, Alice bluntly tells Maggie that her illness is putting stress on the entire family, especially since she can't fulfill Nick's physical needs. When Maggie angrily asks how Alice knows that, she replies that her sensors haven't detected Nick's satisfaction since Maggie returned from the hospital. Furious, Maggie orders Alice to stay in the garage. Later, when Nick comes home, Maggie confronts him, demanding the truth. Nick admits that he slept with Alice once, leading to a heated argument. Alice overhears the yelling by touching the window. Max begins crying, and Alice goes to check on him. Seeing Max as a burden, she places him in the bathtub and begins filling it with water, a horrifying sight witnessed by Isla, who immediately runs to warn her parents. Nick and Maggie rush to the bathroom, but Alice is holding the door shut. Nick begins smashing the door with a lamp while Maggie climbs out a window, walking along the roof to reach the bathroom. As she tries to rescue Max, Alice pushes her against the wall. Nick finally breaks in, rescuing Max and passing him to Isla. He strikes Alice with the lamp to free Maggie. However, Alice rises again and blocks Nick's next attack. Maggie tells Nick to let go, then plugs in the lamp, electrocuting Alice. The house goes dark as Alice collapses. An ambulance arrives to take Max to the hospital, and a company technician arrives to inspect Alice. The technician asks about any signs of malfunction, and Nick apologizes to Maggie, who tells him she needs some space and leaves with the kids. Alice is taken to a repair shop, where a technician begins removing her memory. As her memory is connected to the computer, gaps in her code become apparent. Suddenly, the screens flash with a message indicating an upload is occurring. Alice is taking over the system. The technicians attempt to stop her by disconnecting the computers, but a message appears asking, "How do you run from what's in your head?" Alice 2, another sim containing the original Alice's memories, comes to life, killing one technician and attacking the other before smashing her head repeatedly on the floor. Meanwhile, Nick, drowning his sorrows at a bar, rejects the service of a sim waiter. Suddenly, the original Alice, her face still damaged, appears. She admits to killing Monty and insists that her duty is to make Nick happy. When Nick tries to leave, Alice restrains him and freezes the sim barman with a look. As Nick feigns regret and begins to caress Alice's head, he pulls out her memory, shutting her down. At the hospital, a doctor confirms that Max is fine, but Maggie is uncomfortable around the sim doctors. Isla later hears her mother's voice calling her, but Maggie grabs her and hides when they realize it's actually Alice 2, hunting for them. Alice 2 finds the hospital system, disables the Sims, and tracks the family down using a UV light to follow the blood from Maggie's injured foot. In a desperate escape, Maggie and the kids manage to run outside and get into an ambulance, but Alice 2 tears the door off and blocks the engine system, leaving them trapped. After throwing Maggie onto a car, Alice 2 admits her desire for Nick's love, wishing he loved her the way he loves Maggie. As she grabs Maggie by the neck, she cruelly digs her nails into Maggie's surgery scar. Just then, Nick arrives, interrupting the attack. Maggie kicks Alice 2 off, and Nick runs over the sim with his car, but the impact causes him to crash. As the vehicle catches fire, Maggie frantically tries to pull an unconscious Nick to safety. Despite her efforts and desperate attempts at CPR, he remains unresponsive. Suddenly, the burning car shifts, revealing Alice 2, severely damaged but still alive, her voice eerily echoing through the speakers. She attacks Maggie again, this time choking her and preparing to stab her with a piece of metal from her own body. Before she can strike, Nick, barely conscious, grabs a car bumper and hits Alice 2. The blow causes her to drop the metal, and Maggie quickly grabs it, stabbing Alice 2 in the face, finally shutting her down for good. The next day, After receiving medical treatment, the family is finally able to return home together, grateful to have survived. Meanwhile, at the sim company's repair shop, investigators are looking into the chaos Alice caused. When they restore the power, they find the remnants of her broken code displayed across the screens. The inspector, alarmed by the damage, orders everything to be destroyed. However, just as he gives the command, his sim assistants freeze, and the computer announces another upload. In the final chilling moment, another Alice model opens her eyes, hinting that the nightmare may not be over yet. That's it for today's video. Make sure to like and subscribe to watch more interesting recap videos. Thanks for watching.